Oh. Okay.
Sorry.
Most people think of the league in connection with voter registration and candidate forums, but the league also studies and takes positions on issues such as affordable housing, criminal justice, and climate change. It neither endorses nor opposes candidates for political office. Before I introduce our speaker, I want you all first to meet Madeline Young, our ETHS scholarship winner this year. Madeline, could you please raise your hand? There you go. Congratulations. We're so happy to have you with us today. We are delighted to have Cameron Davis this afternoon. Cam was elected commissioner of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago in 2018. He was reelected in 2020 for a 6-year term. From 2009 until 2017, he was President Obama's Great Lakes point person, serving as the administration's liaison to Capitol Hill and coordinating the work of 11 federal departments responsible for investing more than $2 billion under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Cam has dedicated his entire career to the public's interest in water. He has served as a litigating attorney for the National Wildlife Federation, professor at the University of Michigan Law School, and president and CEO of the Chicago-based Alliance for the Great Lakes. Under his leadership, programs like Adopt a Beach were implemented at the Alliance for the Great Lakes, earning the organization the American Bar Association's Distinguished Award in Environmental Law and Policy. I have a few housekeeping matters. If you have questions, please enter them in chat or save them to the end and raise your hand when we will have plenty of time for questions. Please keep yourself on mute unless you have a question. This program is being taped for later viewing on the league's website, and you may want to use speaker view to listen to the presentation. Welcome, Commissioner Davis.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak with you all today. I'm excited that Betty and Sue Calder are on. I just love seeing them every time I get the chance to see them. And thank you for everything you all do at the League of Women Voters. You know, I think it's been a scary time for democracy over the past several years in particular. And LWV has been one of the organizations that has kind of kept democracy's pulse going. So thank you for that, not just turning out people to vote, but helping to remind us why voting is important and helping to just remind us why being civically engaged is a privilege. It's not something that we can take for granted. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I continue to think that the best way to save our environment and to help save our water is to be actively engaged in democracy. You're doing just that. Let's talk about water. Is anybody really thirsty right now? Because I'm starting to feel pretty thirsty just thinking about it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see if it works. Can you all see my first slide? Okay, I'm seeing some nodding heads. I think that's a good sign right there. All right, I'm going to chat for about 25 minutes or so. As Mark Twain once said, few souls were saved after the first 20 minutes of a sermon. So I try to keep my talks at about 20 minutes or so. Maybe I'll go a little bit longer if I don't see anybody nodding off on me. And I have a very good eye for nodding off. As a former law professor, I keep an eye out for people who are starting to doze. And if I see dozing, one of two things happen. Either I wrap up my lecture or I throw an eraser at somebody to wake them up. I can't throw an eraser at anybody because we're all virtual, so it's going to be the former this time. Let's move on to the next slide if it will let me. Great. Okay, overview. We're going to talk a little bit about climate change and lake levels. We're going to talk about the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan in particular. because after all, that is our Great Lake here in northeastern Illinois, and then the Chicago River system. I think of Lake Michigan as the front door of our region because the sun comes up to the east over Lake Michigan. And I think a little bit, I think of the Chicago River system as our back door, but you can reverse those if you want. I keep wanting to say next slide to somebody else because I'm not used to controlling the slide myself, but looks like I've got it down. Climate change and lake levels. I know some of you wanted to hear a lot about climate change, so we're gonna start off with a trivia question here. Please tell me when these pictures were taken. This is Lake Michigan. This is not Illinois. This is on the Michigan side. But let's see or hear your best guesses on the year or years or decades. And if you want, you're welcome to take yourself off mute. You're welcome to chat if that is easier for you. Let's see, reactions, going to the chat. All right, from a lot coming in, nice. From Mary, 1985. These are going so fast that I'm not sure I can keep up. Betty Hayford, 2020. Candace, 2020 or 2010. Elizabeth, 2008. I hope I'm getting your name right. Kathleen Hayes, 1989. Karen, 1990. Becky Simon, 1972. All very good guesses. Well, you won't be surprised to know that some of you are a little bit hotter than others, speaking of climate change and global warming. On the right, Candace and Betty, you're correct. On the left, excuse me, is 2020. On the right is 1986. And these were taken over on the Michigan side. Now, I've put these pictures into the slideshow because they demonstrate very graphically what happens when you build too close to a water body, in this case, Lake Michigan. I also put them in to remind us how little we seem to learn over the decades. In the mid-1980s, some of you may remember water topping over Lakeshore Drive, which led to the S-curve around Oak Street Beach being reconfigured and raised so that Lakeshore Drive would not be jeopardized. But the fact that we still, on the left, have houses toppling into Lake Michigan, despite having lived through this age of high water levels in the mid-1980s, shows we have a lot to learn. And we have a lot to try to remember when it comes to building and where it's appropriate to have places. The Great Lakes, like most water bodies, levels go up and down. They're behaving exactly like they should. It's we as human beings who have the problem in continuing to think that somehow, because the Great Lakes are so big and so vast, or at least they seem that way, that lake levels won't change dramatically over time. Here's my point. My point is that as people think about climate change, as we discuss climate change, as we debate climate change, one thing is really not debatable. And that is the effects of climate change tend to express themselves in our waterways long before they express themselves in lots of other ways. And when you are living around the largest fresh surface water body on the face of the planet, that is the Great Lakes, you're going to see climate change show up and the impacts from climate change show up much faster than a lot of other places and in a lot of other ways. Lake Michigan is one of the fastest warming lakes on the entire planet, surface of the planet. Lake Superior is another one. Elizabeth, since you have Lake Superior in your background, and these pictures are of Lake Michigan, there's a nice symmetry there. These are among the fastest warming lakes anywhere on the planet. So of course, we're going to see climate change starting to manifest itself around our region much sooner than in other kinds of places. All right. I'm going to get very graphic with you right now. And by graphic, I mean I'm going to use hydrographs. What could be more exciting? What could be more riveting? What could be more adrenaline inducing than hydrographs? All right, maybe I'm just talking about myself right now, but I love hydrographs. I think they're really cool, and I think they're very revealing. So I'm going to present to you the first hydrograph in a series of 3. This is from October of last year. If you can see my cursor, what you see over on the right-hand side is you can see what at the time were forecasts by the Corps of Engineers. We just, and you can see, this is for Lake Superior, of course, Elizabeth, in your honor. And you can see that in the very recent past, we have had very high lake levels in Lake Superior. The blue line is the long-term average over the past, well, since records began to be kept about 100+ years ago. And you see the red line showing the recorded lake levels in the recent past, way up here, way above the long-term average, which is the blue hash line. Now, the reason I'm putting Lake Superior up is because this is what a fairly typical hydrograph for the Great Lakes should look like. What you tend to see is in the springtime, you start to see lake levels going up, like in 2019. Then you get to the summertime and they start to even out. And as the dry, hot summer weather kicks in the summertime, lake levels then even out and then start to go down heading into wintertime. Then again in the spring, March and April, lake levels going back up. You can see the long-term average blue line tracking the more recent actual recorded lake levels here. Why is that? The reason that lake levels tend to go up in the springtime, come around March, April, you have those spring rains starting to kick in. You also have snow melt happening as the winter seeds and transitions into spring. That snow is running off into rivers, and then those river waters are moving downstream into the lakes. So you look at this roller coaster here. It goes up, it goes down, and it's very cyclical based on nature. That is a fairly typical hydrograph. Next, Lake Erie. You see that fairly typical hydrograph again, and it's the same dynamic. Come spring, March, April, lake levels are going up. Come June, July, August, water levels evening out, and then that dry weather. Remember, there's a lag time between when it rains and when it's dry and how the lake levels express themselves. So come summertime, evening out, as you head into the fall, that dry summer weather is taking effect with lake levels starting to go down until the pattern repeats itself heading into next spring, and then the summer and the fall going down again. You get the idea. Again, this is Lake Erie from 2020, a fairly typical hydrograph. Now, our lake, Lake Michigan, you start to see in the spring, and this is from 2020, October of 2020, you see the spring runoff kicking in. Uh-oh. Start to see spring runoff kicking in, spring rains kicking in, summer, and it should be evening off and going back down. But wait a second, what's happening here? Those lake levels stayed very constant in 2019. Why is that? That's because a normal summer, we should see that hot, dry weather kicking in. We did not see that in 2019. What we saw was rain that continued through the summer and into the fall. And as a result, instead of seeing a fairly normal hydrograph with lake levels starting to level off in the summer and dip back down going into the fall, we saw lake levels stay constant. Here again, blue dotted line, long-term average. That's normal. You see these ups and these downs. What we saw in 2019 was the up, and then it basically stayed up. It dropped just a tiny bit. And then again, in the spring of 2020, just last year, we saw lake levels go up again. So Lake Michigan really never had the chance to normalize in the summer and in the fall of 2019. It stayed pretty much put. And then we got that wet spring weather again last year. So the lake levels went up again. And this is what happened. You see these little lines here from 1986. That's when the previous monthly high lake level water levels were recorded. We broke Lake Michigan water levels for new monthly highs in the spring of last year and going into the summer of last year. And that is what you see right around here. We had record high water levels in Lake Michigan last year. All right. My hope is that because we had a very dry summer, and we're starting to see this now, it's more than a hope, this has come to pass. For those of you who follow me on Twitter, I predicted we would see lake levels drop and start to normalize this year, because last summer we had a very hot, dry summer like we are supposed to have. How many of you remember August 10th of last year in our region? I bet none of you do. There's no reason that date ought to stand out except for one thing, and that is we had a derecho. It's a little bit like a tornado, but not quite the same thing, pass just below Chicago, to the south of Chicago, and just to the south of the bottom of Lake Michigan. That was because Iowa had seen really hot, dry conditions in June and July. In other words, really a drought in Iowa just to our west. And that created the hot, dry, that was indicative of the hot, dry weather that we had last summer. That hot, dry weather, and for those of you who remember, I know here in Evanston on August 10th, we had trees down on that day. It was like a tornado was passing close by. Those kinds of conditions were indicative of that hot, dry weather that helps return lake levels to normal, whatever that is, or within a normal range, come the fall. That we never had the chance to return to normal in October 2020, which is why we broke monthly record high water levels in the summer, and from the spring and into the summer, really going back into January of last year through July and August of last year. Okay, but with that dry weather, those lake levels return to normal, which means that today we have seen a drop of lake levels by about a foot or so from last year. If you own property along a Great Lakes coast, that's the kind of thing that gives you a great sense of relief. Okay. Now, why do these lake levels go up and down? And why are they exacerbated by climate change? Well, I've mentioned why lake levels go up, those spring rains and that snow melt in the early part of a year lead to water moving into a system like Lake Michigan. So precipitation is one reason why lake levels fluctuate. The more precipitation, the higher the lake levels go. But the other reason is evaporation. So the two shins, precipitation and evaporation. What does evaporation look like? Has anybody ever seen it? Probably not that you can think of. But I'm showing you a picture now of what evaporation looks like. I took this picture on October 2nd of last year in Evanston after dropping my son off at his Evanston Township High School swimming team practice at dark, whatever it was. I think I dropped him off around 5:45 a.m. at the high school. And when I had gotten back when I had headed back to Lake Michigan off of Ridge Avenue, I could see in the distance what looked like a mountain range over the lake. Well, of course, there are no mountains over Lake Michigan. So that means that these clouds really were evaporation at work. This is what it looks like when hundreds of millions of gallons of water are leaving the system. Okay, these humongous clouds over Lake Michigan. This is what it looks like when Lake Michigan water is evaporating up into the sky. If this were to happen in wintertime, this was in the fall, the westerly winds move toward the east, and essentially blow these evaporation clouds over into Indiana and into the lower peninsula of Michigan. And that is why you have lake effect snow in the wintertime. Lake levels are a big deal. They can be a matter of life and death. It's not just, interesting information that I'm providing. When lake levels go up and when climate change makes lakes more turbulent, you also tend to see, unfortunately, an increase in lake-related deaths, drownings in particular. Now, some of this bar graph is just a little bit misleading because, of course, we have the Chicago region, which is the most densely populated region around the Great Lakes. We have, for example, Chicago and Milwaukee, which are almost quickly becoming one city given the development that's happening in between. And even though Toronto on Lake Ontario has now surpassed Chicago as the largest the largest city by population on the Great Lakes, we still have a very densely populated region on Lake Michigan, Milwaukee, Chicago, Northwest Indiana. You get the idea. All right. The health of the Great Lakes is really important, and it's related to climate change. But over the past several generations, we have had polluted hotspots, toxic hotspots around the Great Lakes. Some of you may know the one that's closest to us in northeastern Illinois, Waukegan Harbor, once called by the media the world's worst PCB mess. That is because literally, factually, half of the sediment in Waukegan Harbor was comprised of PCBs. 500,000 parts per million PCBs. When you have 1 million parts per million, that's a 1-to-1 ratio. That means 100%. So 500,000 parts per million is half of the million. That's 50% sediment comprised of toxic PCBs in Waukegan Harbor. Waukegan Harbor has been one of 30 plus what are called areas of concern around the Great Lakes. Some of you may be familiar with the Grand Calumet River and Indiana Harbor Canal. That's what you drive over when you're on the Skyway, Route 90. But others include the Milwaukee Estuary area of concern, Green Bay, the Fox River that flows through Green Bay, the Detroit River, the Buffalo River. I could go on, but I won't. We have some of the most toxic hotspots around the Great Lakes anywhere in the country. And they have created real havoc for the communities that house those working harbors and rivers. Invasive species have been another threat to the Great Lakes. For example, quagga mussels and zebra mussels that have gotten into the Great Lakes filter the plankton out of the Great Lakes. That plankton is the base of the food web. If you go to the Chesapeake, as many of you have, you know that soft shell crab is something that that region is particularly proud of, and it's also something that that region takes a lot of pride in. If you go to the Pacific Northwest, salmon is very much part of the cultural fabric of that region. Here in the Great Lakes, we have iconic species like whitefish and yellow perch. Sometimes they're called lake perch. I remember fishing for those off the pier in Wilmette, right by Wilmette Harbor and across the street from the Baha'i Temple when I was a kid. And they weren't hard to catch. These days, they're a lot harder to catch because quagga and zebra mussels as invasive species have gotten into the Great Lakes and have sucked the food out of the base of the food web, above which, that in that food pyramid, species like whitefish and yellow perch exist. Asian carp is probably the most important invasive species we're combating in this region. As bighead and silver carp move their way up the Illinois River toward the Chicago River, and heading toward Lake Michigan, one of the jobs of the federal government with which I used to serve and co-chaired the Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee, the job of the federal government with the states and others is to block those Asian carp and keep them from getting into the Great Lakes for the very same reason. They can eat up to 30% of their body weight daily in plankton, which is a little bit like somebody coming into your kitchen and stealing your food. If you don't have plankton in your ecosystem, you don't have the raw material for a food web because they are at the base of that food pyramid. Polluted runoff is another example of a threat to our waterways. I remember getting a call when I was serving in the Obama administration, an emergency call one weekend saying, in Toledo, our drinking water supply has shut down. Well, Toledo is at the mouth of the Maumee River. It's the largest river in the Great Lakes. And the thing that's interesting about the Maumee River is that the land that drains into the Maumee River, that drains through Toledo into Lake Erie, that land is largely comprised of agriculture. It's one of the most heavily farmed areas in the country. And when fertilizer is applied to agricultural areas and you have a heavy spring rain, that fertilizer can wash off of those agricultural areas and wash through the river downstream into the lake. And that's exactly what happened in August of 2014, about 7 years ago now. That's what happened. Fertilizer had washed off of upstream agricultural areas into the river, moved its way downstream into Lake Erie, and essentially fertilized algae in Lake Erie, and fertilized algae so excessively that that algae turned toxic. There was so much of it that the Toledo drinking water supply had to be shut off for a weekend in August of 2014. That's not the kind of thing you think about happening around the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes comprise 20% of the world's fresh surface water supply, 21%, so give or take. It also comprises about 84% of North America's fresh surface water supply and 95% of the US fresh surface water supply. The Great Lakes have always been here to us. They've always been comprised of fresh water. And that water has always been one of the best drinking water sources anywhere on the planet. So having a major municipality's drinking water supply shut down as a result of polluted runoff is something that has been unfathomable to many of us. But it still happened, and it happened relatively recently. And it happened because nutrients like phosphorus, a key component of fertilizer, had washed excessively off into a tributary. Now, phosphorus doesn't need to just come from agricultural areas. It can run off of suburban areas and urban areas. If it's applied to lawns excessively, it can happen here too. Now, Lake Erie is the shallowest and most sensitive of all the Great Lakes. So it's not a shock, at least to somebody like me who's done Great Lakes work their entire career, that this might happen. And it does not mean that just because it's happened there, that it will happen here in Chicago at the same time. It can happen here. It has happened on Lake Michigan. Green Bay has seen pockets of what's called hypoxia, that is the deprivation of oxygen that feeds aquatic life. So Green Bay has seen hypoxia. Lake Erie has seen hypoxia. Saginaw Bay in Michigan, north of Detroit, has seen hypoxia. And a lot of it is tied to excess phosphate-based or phosphorus-based fertilizer in agricultural areas. So it's something that we need to take care of. Habitat is another key threat to the Great Lakes. We have lost a lot of habitat like wetlands around our Great Lakes. Wetlands serve as important filters to help improve water quality. They also help retain flood water. So if you live on property that's prone to flooding, wetlands in the past were probably the kind of thing that could help reduce flooding around private property. So very important that way. They're also critical habitat for fish and ducks. Education and science is another thing. I think of it when we don't do our science well and we don't do our education well. I think of those as threats to the Great Lakes as well. The good news with all of this is we've had a program called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative that has helped to combat all of these threats. Because of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative combined with other funding programs, we've been cleaning up our toxic hotspots. We've been battling invasive species like Asian carp. We've been battling polluted runoff like the kind I talked to you about related to Toledo. We've been combating habitat loss, and we've been doing good science and educating the next generation about how to make good decisions. Now, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has been funded at about $300 million per year. It's a relatively new program. President Obama proposed it, and a bipartisan Congress funded it. So it's been a very popular program with Republicans and Democrats on the Hill, but it's not a program that we can take for granted will always be here. In fact, for 3 of the 4 years that he was president, the Trump White House proposed to all but eliminate this Great Lakes Restoration Initiative program. Now, I know LWV is nonpartisan, so let me make this very clear statement. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative ignored the Trump White House and fully funded the GLRI. Those are Republicans and Democrats alike. It's been a very important program. It's enjoyed a great deal of bipartisan support on Capitol Hill. But this is simply to say that we cannot take for granted that a program like this will always be here, especially just so recently. We saw proposals year after year by the Trump White House to cut funding for this vital program. Here in our region, not knowing who your elected representatives are, we're talking about the federal level. Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky has been a true hero for this program, has supported it very consistently. Our 2 senators, Durbin and Duckworth, have also supported full funding for the GLRI as well. So for those of you who like to be in touch with your elected representatives and senators, I think a thanks is in order to them. they don't need to be lobbied to support the program and try to save funding at this point. But it's always a good idea to thank people when they do a good job. That's the GLRI. Those are some of the threats and some of the fixes to the ecosystem that we all are, I think, concerned about and interested in. But of course, I mentioned, I think of Lake Michigan as the front door, the Chicago River system as the back door. I don't mean that to sound that one's superior or inferior to the other. I like my back door very much, and I like my front door very much. I use both of them all the time. This is a picture, believe it or not, of the Chicago River just upstream and across from Lane Tech in the city. You'd think that this picture might have been taken somewhere on the Illinois River downstream, but it's not. This is in the thick of Chicago. We are really lucky to have such great urban parks. And I think the goal, at least one of my priorities at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, where I've been lucky enough to serve since 2018 as an elected commissioner, one of my goals is to keep greenifying the waterway, the shores of the Chicago River, whether it's the main stem or the North Branch or other parts of the Chicago area waterway system. Greening our shorelines along the river system is a top priority. And it is not something that is going to come easily. It's not something that, I hate to use the term, but it's not something that's going to come without a fight because it takes a lot of persistence and a lot of tenacity. For example, I just recently voted against a parking lot to be leased along one of our waterway shoreline areas in the Chicago metro region, and also to be exact, because I believe over time we need to be greening our shorelines, not building walls and hardening our shorelines. One of our jobs at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District has been to reduce sewer overflows. There are a couple of kinds of sewer overflows, at least. There's sanitary sewer overflows that have untreated waste, including industrial waste. We've done a very good job at reducing those to the point of almost being eliminated. Combined sewer overflows are where you have that heavy waste combined with a stormwater system, and that's the combination in the term combined sewer overflows. Waste, stormwater. Stormwater is basically rain that runs off of roofs and off of streets. It may pick up some oil and grease from cars and things like that, but otherwise stormwater is generally not what you want to have moving through a treatment plant because it's expensive to treat. We are also working to reduce combined sewer overflows. If you really want to be hip and really want to be cool at your next cocktail party, try to use the term CSO, the acronym CSO, in your conversation. Some people will think you're talking about the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. When you hear me talking about CSOs, I'm talking about combined sewer overflows because I find them as fascinating as classical music. Habitat. We have a lot of habitat opportunities around the Chicago area waterway system. And we're also increasingly concerned about equity at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. It turns out that the neighborhoods that are most prone to flooding are typically those that it's not a coincidence, are typically disproportionately impacted communities or communities that are below the median wealth level here around Cook County. So one of my jobs as a commissioner, and I'm doing this with my fellow commissioners every day, is to keep making sure that our lower lying communities that are disproportionately impacted by flooding, which also tend to be with heavily concentrated minority populations, that we are making sure that we are serving them, protecting them, and helping them every bit as much as we are our more affluent communities. So that is increasingly an issue for the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District staff and board, making sure that we are treating everybody equitably, treating all communities equitably when it comes to helping them against the threats of flooding. So I'm going to close with this before I completely lose my voice. One of the things that I tend to really like to think about is, what is our vision for our waterways, the Lake Michigan shoreline or our Chicago River shoreline, over the next 10 years, 25 years, 50 years, 100 years. Nothing really happens unless you know where you want to go, and unless you have a vision for the long-term sustainability of the places that you love, the places that you care about, like our Great Lakes lakefront, like the Chicago River system and things like that. So I'm always interested to hear what other people think about what the future of our waterways ought to be. And I am basically going to close with that. I have a few websites and resources for folks if they want them, and I can leave that up if you want. But this is how you reach me if you would like to be in touch. When we are all back in action here and able to get together in person, one of the things that we like to do, and I like to do, is get folks set up with tours of our water reclamation plants. For those of you who might be tempted to think that that is probably one of the least interesting things you could tour in your life, I will tell you this story. The year before last, because the pandemic kicked in March of last year, but in May of 2019, I told my then 12-year-old son and then 7-year-old daughter that we were having an open house at one of our water reclamation plants, and that they were welcome to join me. And their first reaction was, "Oh, gross." And then they said, "Cool, let's go." Because when you're a kid between 7 and 14, the grossest stuff in life is somehow the coolest stuff in life. Don't ask me why. It's a long time since I've been that age. I just know it happens to be true. So if you have kids or grandkids who ever want to tour a water reclamation plant once we're up and running again, please be in touch, and I'm glad to help clue you in as to when our open houses will be. With that, I'm going to just take a pause and see if you have any questions.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
What is the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District doing, if anything, about PFAS in the water?
Great, thank you for the question. I think you're referring to PFAS, PFAS, which is what we call a forever chemical. It's been used in flame retardants, everything in furniture, from furniture to clothing, to being used to put out fires and things like that. That winds up in our system. They are being phased out. The production of them has been phased out, but they still do show up around the country, and they are in blood of 97, 98% of Americans. One of the things that we're doing right now is monitoring for PFAS. I don't think we've been as hard hit by PFAS, fortunately, as other places around the country that may have had a manufacturing plant near them. We have not in the Chicago metro region. But one of the things that we're doing is monitoring for them. And there really is no technology to get rid of them at this point, although we are supporting a lot of R&D to help figure out how we can get rid of PFAS.
Becky Simon has a question.
Sure.
Let me take my hand down here. It looks kind of silly.
And while you're doing that, I do see another question. Where are lake levels measured? They tend to be measured in various places around the Great Lakes by the U.S. Geological Survey. and NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Okay, I in DuPage County right now, so you're wondering why the heck I'm here. I'm actually looking out at the DuPage River from my dining room windows, but I grew up in Waukegan. So when you talked about Waukegan, that really tugged at my heartstrings. I grew up with the asbestos, the coal ash slurries, the PCBs, the tannery waste, the chromium, the coke, all of that stuff. And I watched the Zion nuclear power plant get built, and I watched the cooling towers come down. So my question for you, is there any hope for that part of the lakeshore? I grew up there. I love it. It's the only place I've ever seen oak and yucca growing side by side. Is there any hope for the Waukegan Harbor?
Yeah. Well, thank you for your question, Becky. And even though you're in DuPage County, I'm glad you're here because the DuPage River is still connected to the Chicago area waterway system. Is there any hope for Waukegan? Not just is there only hope, but actually Waukegan, the Waukegan Harbor is going to come off of the cleanup list, if not this year, then next year. And that's thanks to programs like Superfund and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative that I mentioned before. Without funding, the work can't get done. And if the work doesn't get done, the cleanup doesn't happen. Because the funding has come in, those cleanups have accelerated. So when I got my start in my career in 1986, Waukegan Harbor was just starting to be understood as a real problem, as you know from living and growing up in that area. Here we are now 30 plus years later, and actually the harbor's cleaned up and it's due to be taken off the list anytime. I've seen, and one of the most rewarding things about my previous job with the Obama administration was going from area of concern to area of concern and hearing people tell me that they thought that their area of concern would never be taken off the cleanup list, that it would never be restored. Not only are they being restored, but they're going to be taken off the cleanup list in our lifetimes. That to me was not something that seemed likely 20 or even 10 years ago. I see another question here from Candace, and let me also acknowledge we've got Lois and Mike Taft on the screen. Hey guys. I would probably not have been elected had it not been for them coming out of the gate so quickly in my support back in 2018. So always good to see you. Next question from Candace. Is there going to be a long-term increase in Lake Michigan water levels at the multi-decadal scale? It's too early for us to say at this point. However, I do know that the Canadian federal government is now doing modeling for long-term forecasts of lake levels. Those models are due out toward the end of this year, and those will provide us with a sneak preview as to what we may be able to see looking much longer term than the hydrographs that I showed you before, which only look out about 6 months. You can go out further than that, but they tend to be forecasts that are not that accurate. But that may be changing very soon given the state of the science. I will tell you too, not so much multi-decadal, but looking at the near term, you know, the past 3 years, we've had the wettest May on record here in the Chicago region. In 2018, we set a record for the wettest May on record. In 2019, we set a new record for the wettest May on record, breaking the 2018 record. And then last year in 2020, we had the wettest May on record, breaking the 2019 and 2018 records. We just closed out May yesterday at midnight. And guess what? We did not have a wet May. We did not have the wettest May on record. So that's also a sign that we may be returning to some sense of normalcy. Linda, what is the situation on coastal erosion up by Kenosha? Years ago, they were filling it with giant boulders, things like that. The lake record high monthly lake levels that we've seen and that I mentioned it early in the presentation. Excuse me, starting to lose my voice. With those lake levels going down, that ought to help relieve some of our coastal areas quite a bit. Lois, what about ballast water discharges? Thanks, great question. What Lois is asking about, or maybe that was Mike, I don't know who asked the question. I'm just going to treat both of you as interchangeable. Lois and Mike asked the question because they're a team. What the Tafts are talking about is when a big ocean-going freight ship leaves, let's say, Europe and goes across the Atlantic to come into the St. Lawrence River and into the Great Lakes, one of the things that it does is it fills its ballast tank with water, which helps stabilize its voyage as it goes across the ocean. What it will do is suck up water in the port overseas, and with it, a lot of species that exist in that area. Then when it gets to the Great Lakes, it would spit that ballast water out, and with it, expunge all of those invasive species as well. The problem is those species may be native over there, but they're not native here. And so if those species are discharged through ballast water here in the Great Lakes, but they've never existed here, those invasive species can take over. And that's exactly what happened with quagga mussels and zebra mussels that I mentioned earlier in my presentation. They got into the Great Lakes through ballast tanks. They were discharged into the Great Lakes from ballast tanks. And once into the Great Lakes, they started to take over. There has been a practice since 2006 that ocean-going freighters, once they leave their ports overseas and get into the open ocean, have to discharge their ballast water in the open ocean and pull more ballast water in. That salt water from the middle of the ocean tends to kill virtually all of the invasive species that may be left. And then discharge that ballast water back in the ocean if the conditions are safe to do that. That practice of what's called ballast exchange has kept invasive species out of the Great Lakes since 2006, since that practice has been implemented. The problem is that until not long ago, there was a proposal for rules by the Coast Guard to get rid of that ballast exchange practice. One of the things that I did while I was with the Obama administration at EPA was I worked really hard to keep ballast water exchange rules in place by EPA. And we won. We won that battle, kept ballast water exchange in place under rules with the EPA. However, again, it didn't happen easily. That had to get elevated to my boss, the head of the EPA and the head of the Coast Guard. We won that battle, but there is almost every year or every other year a proposal to eliminate that ballast water exchange. And we are the only region in the country that still requires ballast water exchange for this very reason, to keep those invasive species out through ballast water discharges. Let me take one more because I'm about to lose my voice completely. What's the status of the battle against Asian carp? The status is that we are winning that battle. The fix has been for commercial fishermen to go in, take nets, and basically scoop out Asian carp from the Illinois River system. If you don't have fish in the system, fish can't breed in the system. And if fish can't breed in the system, they can't migrate upstream in the system toward Lake Michigan. That work to suppress those populations downstream in the Illinois system has been very, very effective. In fact, they're called Asian carp. They come from Asia. One of the reasons that those populations has been controlled in Asia is because those fish have been fished out. They've been used as fertilizer. They are used as pet food. You can eat them themselves. They tend to be a little bit bony, but hey, they're just like chicken, like a lot of other things. So with that, let me go ahead and close out and just say thank you to LWV for everything that you do, for your interest in saving our waterways and continuing to help educate people about the importance of democracy. Like I said at the outset, I think democracy is the best defense of our natural resources. And if people aren't turning out to vote, if people aren't engaged, nature suffers because of it. So thank you for caring.
Well, thank you so much, Commissioner Davis, for speaking to us today. We've really enjoyed it. It's been very educational and very informative. We really appreciate your being here. If one question was whether you could put your resource page into chat, is that possible?
Maybe what I can do is I can have, I'll ask my Chief of Staff, Dawn Walker, to share that resource page. So if somebody could just email Dawn at WalkerD, that's WALKERD at MWRD, we'll make sure that we get that resource page to you for distribution.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for putting up with me. I haven't eaten lunch, so I'm starting to get a little bit faint here. I'm going to run, go grab something to eat so I can get my faculties back.
Sounds like a good plan. Take care.
All right. Thanks,
Have a good
everybody.
day, everybody.
Thanks very much.